Today, we're going to be taking our very first look at the Tier 8 tech tree American battleship, the USS Minnesota, and we've got a guest along with us to help us do it. The guest is the Monk 52. He's playing another Tier 8 ship, one that I don't yet have, but one that I am looking forward to. It is the Sejong, the Tier 8 Pan-Asian cruiser. And we've spawned on the Two Brothers map with a domination mode set up rather than capture the base. So since we spawned in the center along with the destroyer, we're heading over to the alpha flank. And it's going to take us a very long time to get there and to get into the action because amongst many things that you could say about the Minnesota, one of the things you could say is that this ship is not very fast. It does have a good amount of hit points, though, and unfortunately we don't have it fully upgraded. We do have the engine upgrade, so we've got the maximum possible speed, and we've also got the gun upgrade, but what we don't have is the hull upgrade. And maybe that's a little bit of an unusual trajectory for installing upgrades. I know a lot of people will install the hull upgrade first before anything else, but I chose to install the engine upgrade because without it, this ship only has a top speed of 22.5 knots, and 22.5 knots, when you're maneuvering, really turns into something more like 18 knots. So, engine boost was one thing I put, and then I put the gun range on to have the maximum possible gun range. Just felt a little too short without it. But once you do have the hull upgrade on this thing, it has a base amount of hit points of 76.3k, and it's got a 16.7 second rudder shift, which all in all is not really that bad in terms of survivability and maneuverability. It's also got a lot of armor and a good amount of torpedo damage reduction. The torpedo damage reduction is 40%. That's getting up there with the likes of the best in the game, the Alabamas, Massachusetts, and Yamatos of the world. And the armor, well, the entire hull is abnormally and very unusually coated in 50mm plating, both on the belt and on the decks. The only places where there aren't 50mm plating are the two tiny sections of bow and stern, which are the usual 32, as well as the turrets, which are very heavily armored, and then the gigantic 19mm superstructure. This 50 millimeters of armor, you might think it offers you a fair bit of protection, because after all, 50 millimeters is enough to bounce even Yamato shells. It certainly can't be overmatched by them, and it would shatter most of the low-caliber HE that comes into contact with it. The problem just is the shape of the ship. It's just really, really thick, and it's gigantic, so even though you have 50 millimeter armor, you also have a bunch of shell-catching surfaces all over the ship, which means that even if you're angled and you get hit by large caliber guns, the 50mm armor usually just sort of means they're going to pen and deal full penetration damage. And the HE, even if it does shatter on your side armor or your deck, which it probably will, it's much more likely to hit your massive superstructure, and of course there, it's easily going to pen, and there's also the fires. So this ship is very much a gigantic damage pinata, and it's really the guns that are the massive highlight. These are 12 16-inch guns. They range out to 19.2 kilometers. They've got a maximum AP shell damage of 12,800, and that is before gyrating drill bits. I'm not actually running gyrating drill bits on this commander for the Minnesota, because one of the effects of that skill is to reduce the ship's speed by 10%, and that just feels bad on this ship. I'm running the other one that increases the turret traverse speed, or rather, increases the turret traverse speed, but does not affect the ship's speed. So I've got the full 25 knots out of this. And by the way, right there with that salvo that I don't know if that was the main or something else that shot at me, but you see, we were fairly angled, but we got absolutely chunked for a huge amount of our HP. No citadels, but a ton of AP penetrations. It's a damage pinata in that way. The bad thing about these guns, of course, is that they have a very long reload. It's a 34-second base reload. The good thing about them is that they're kind of cracked. They absolutely smack broadsides. They're excellent at punishing them, just like the predecessor to this ship at Tier 7, the Kansas. This is very much of the same. It more or less is a Kansas, it just has essentially more armor and more HP. Otherwise, if you've played the Kansas and you enjoy it, you're probably going to enjoy this ship. If you played the Kansas and not enjoyed it, well, then you're not going to like this ship. It really is all about the guns. And as you can see, they're excellent at punishing broadsides. Just imagine what would have happened if we had hit the main with all 12 instead of only 6. We might not have to leave that up to the imagination. Looks like our guns are finally about to turn, but the main gets spanked by somebody else on our team. And so this flank over here on the alpha side is basically secure. The destroyer's already captured it. It's turned blue. We've only got that main and that Vladivostok out there, and they don't really look like they're going to be presenting it much of a threat. So probably it's time to turn our attention back over toward Delta. You can see the monk is already headed back there, and I'm going to follow suit as the main, I suppose, takes one last final parting shot. I think he is about to go down. We should probably talk a little bit more about the ship's stats. We already know that the maneuverability is not so great. 25 knots, though, is certainly better than the alternative. I highly recommend not running gyrating drill bits on this ship so that you can actually move it around. The AA defense is, I don't think, anything special. It certainly has a lot of AA and secondary guns all over the ship, but it's only got an AA defense rating of 83, and the highest DPS of any of the AA guns comes from the 40mm Bofors that have a middling 3.5 kilometer range and do an average damage of 181 per second. The long range isn't too bad at 121 per second, but ultimately I don't think this AA really has much bite to it. The concealment's pretty good. With Kondo and the concealment mod, I've got it down to 12.9, which is maybe on the higher end, but still, anything under 13 kilometers for a battleship is good. And the concealment is probably something you would want to spec into in this particular ship, especially if your approach to battleships is anything like mine. Being so slow and being so gigantic and thick means you are a very easy target to hit, and you don't really have the ability to disengage when the situation gets too hot and heavy. Basically, every single ship on the enemy team, aside from other Minnesotas and maybe Kansases, are going to be faster than you. So you're never really going to be running away from anything, and therefore you probably don't want to be spotted as early, because if you do, well, again, the ship is gigantic, and even if it is coated in 50mm plating, we've already seen how thoroughly chunked it can get, and that's to say nothing of the HE spam melting it. This thing could be melted fairly quick. Unfortunately, our division mate, the Monk, goes down to the predecessor of his ship, the Harbin, and we instantly avenge him with a dev strike on the very same cruiser. We've got an enemy destroyer that's on the map border coming for our CV rather than trying to take the Bravo cap or doing something, useful for his team. I think he's ultimately going to fail in taking down the CV, and we've got both a battleship and I think our friendly destroyer, who right now is near the Alpha cap, is actually sailing south to deal with the enemy destroyer. We probably could be pointing our guns that way to shoot at that enemy destroyer, but right now we're just trying to take down the Kansas. I feel like when you have the opportunities to shoot at other ships, it can be more difficult in the Minnesota than certain other battleships, just because the long reload. 34 seconds is a very long time to wait if you aim a salvo at a destroyer and then come up short. You don't hit anything and you've got to wait another 34 seconds for these things to reload. Sometimes, it can be rough. But I suppose the question is it worth it to buy the Minnesota? After all these Tier 8 tech tree ships, there's a lot of them, you got a lot of choices to choose between, and you probably don't have enough silver to buy them all. I certainly don't. I have enough silver to buy maybe one more Tier 8 tech tree ship, and maybe get all of the modules on it, maybe not. They're very expensive. And ultimately, I feel like Tier 8 is a little bit of a mess in its implementation in this game. I thought it was a great idea when it was first announced. Obviously, it would be nice to have the ships between Tier 10 and Tier 8 on PC, which are the Tier 9s. And previously, before the introduction of Tier 8, we didn't really have a tier where Tier 9 ships from PC fit very well. They were either put down into Tier 7, which would be the PC equivalent of Tier 8, or they were bumped up into Legendary Tier, which would be the PC equivalent of Tier 10. But now that we have Tier 8, the offerings that we have on store just seem kind of underwhelming. And I think part of that is issue with the game design of World of Warships Legends from the beginning. The game was only designed to have 7 tiers at the start, and then they subsequently added in Legendary Tier and Tier 8 in a way that feels disconnected. Pretty much everything at Tier 8, this ship included, is sort of a transitory ship on PC. You don't really spend a whole lot of time playing certain Tier 9s. You grind through them to get to the Tier 10. And in this game, there are a lot of Tier 8 ships that have successors at Legendary Tier. And it does sometimes feel to me like, what's the point of playing these ships when you can just get the better version at Legendary Tier? That, I think, affects the majority of the Tier 8 tech trees, actually. There are a couple that I think are worth playing, like, for example, the Kitakazi. But then there are also a couple you could simply skip, like, in my opinion, the other American battleship, the Maine, which is just a down-tiered Montana, and I think is basically inferior to the Montana. So why would you ever want to play it? What about the Minnesota, though? Where does it fit in that whole scenario? That's a little bit more difficult of a question to parse out, I would say. Is it actually worth playing? Well, as of now, there is no legendary tier successor to the Minnesota in this game. The Vermont is not yet available to us. Maybe when it is, then I would say the Minnesota really isn't worth buying or worth playing. But if you're a fan of the Kansas, and I know that there are a lot of Kansas fans out there, then you're probably going to like this ship. It is an upgrade from the Kansas, a very incremental upgrade, in the sense that it has heavier armor, and the guns maybe are a little bit more accurate, or maybe are in some way a little bit more cracked than the Kansas's guns. I don't know. I think I have to play this ship more. But the guns are effective. This was one of our earlier games in the Minnesota, and we ended with 4 kills and 150,000 damage done. I think a pretty solid result, and these are the kind of results that I've been getting with this ship. Ultimately, it's a mediocre hull with excellent guns. And sometimes when it comes to battleships, excellent guns are all that you need. So I would say it's a good ship. It's probably one that not a lot of people are going to like due to the exceptionally slow speed and the rather damage pinata-like nature of just the sheer size of the thing. It's just dummy thick, you know? It is a gigantic pinata that everybody wants to shoot at. So there's that. But at the same time, the guns are really, really consistent and really nice. And if you're the type of player who really gets frustrated by RNG, transporting your shells to areas on a ship that you didn't aim at, or maybe areas behind of or in front of the ship, there's a lot less of that on Minnesota, just because of how accurate the guns are. So I enjoy the ship. I think ultimately, once the Vermont enters the fray, it's maybe not all that worth playing, because really it's just a ship that you would normally grind through to get the Vermont, at least on PC. But it's a fun ship. I definitely enjoy it, and hopefully this was a good game to show it off a little bit. And I hope you enjoyed it. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.